Autumn, 1944. Somewhere above the Dutch border, 28,000 feet. A Junkers 88 of the German night fighter force is flying through darkness so complete that the pilot cannot see his own wingtips. He is an experienced man. He has kills against British bombers, all of them achieved at night, all of them guided by the glow of the Liechtenstein radar scope mounted in front of his radar operator in the rear seat. Tonight, the scope is alive. A pale green line sweeps across the cathode ray tube, and his operator is reading the familiar pattern of returns, faint blips at the edge of the screen that mean a British bomber is somewhere ahead of them, in the blackness, fat, and slow and blind. They have done this before. The pilot eases the throttles forward and begins a shallow climb to position above the target for a Schrage music attack. The upward-firing cannons strike from below that the British have never found a reliable defence against. He does not check behind him. There is nothing behind him. There cannot be anything behind him. He is invisible. He is flying in total darkness over occupied territory with no navigation lights and no radio transmissions. The only electronic emission from his aircraft is the radar pulse of his own Liechtenstein set, and that pulse is his weapon, his advantage, the thing that lets him find bombers that cannot see him. 30 seconds later, 20mm cannon shells tear through the fuselage of his Junkers 88 from directly astern. The instrument panel explodes. The port engine catches fire. He never sees the aircraft that killed him. His radar operator never registers a contact. There is no warning of any kind. One moment they are hunters, the next moment they are burning. This was not a single incident. This happened dozens of times across the autumn and winter of 1944. The aircraft that destroyed them was a de Havilland Mosquito of No. 100 Group, RAF Bomber Command. It found them, not by seeing them, not by hearing them. It found them by listening to the one thing the German pilot believed made him invisible. It found them by homing on the radar signal of his own Liechtenstein set, using a device called serrate that turned the German night fighter's greatest technological advantage into a homing beacon that drew death directly toward him. Across the Luftwaffe's night fighter force in the autumn of 1944, the question was being asked in every briefing room, every dispersal hut, and every officer's mess from Holland to Bavaria. How are they finding us in total darkness? How are they seeing what cannot be seen? The Germans had a word for what was happening to their night fighter crews. They called it Moskitoschreck, mosquito terror. It was not a formal designation. It was a sickness of the nerves. Pilots who had spent months as confident hunters began refusing to turn on their radars for fear that the radar itself would attract the thing that killed them. Crews were landing early, reporting phantom contacts, requesting transfers out of the night fighter arm. Ground controllers would vector a fighter toward a bomber stream, and the pilot would acknowledge the vector and then turn away, flying in circles until he could report no contact and return to base. Some crews were simply disappearing on routine patrols, and the men who survived could not explain how. An aircraft would take off, check in by radio, and never be heard from again. No distress call. No combat report. Just silence and an empty dispersal bay in the morning. To understand how the hunters became the hunted, and why the men who built the most sophisticated night defense system in the history of aerial warfare could not stop it from being turned inside out against them, we need to go back not to 1944, not even to the start of the war. We need to go back to a freezing afternoon in February of 1935, to a muddy field in Northamptonshire, England, where a Scottish physicist named Robert Watson Watt and his assistant Arnold Wilkins parked a van on the side of the road and pointed an antenna at the sky. And what they proved in the next 20 minutes would, within a decade, quietly decide who lived and who died in the night skies over Europe. The question Watson Watt had been asked was simple. Could radio waves be used to destroy an aircraft? The answer was no, but Wilkins, running the calculations, realized something else. Radio waves could not destroy an aircraft, but they could detect one. On February 26, 1935, they parked their van near the BBC shortwave transmitter at Daventry and aimed a receiver at the sky while a Hayford bomber flew back and forth through the beam 8 miles away. The cathode ray tube in the van flickered. Every time the bomber passed through the beam, the signal jumped. They could see an aircraft that was invisible to the naked eye, using nothing but radio waves bouncing off its metal skin. It was the birth of radar. Within 18 months, Watt's team had moved to Bawdsey Manor on the Suffolk coast, and by September of 1937, RAF Bawdsey became the world's first operational radar station. By the time war broke out in September of 1939, more than 20 chain home stations ringed the coast of Britain, feeding aircraft positions into a layered reporting network that Watt had helped design. That network ran from the radar stations to a central filter room, and from the filter room to Fighter Command's sector stations, and from the sector stations to the squadron readiness rooms, where pilots sat in their flight gear waiting for the scramble bell. It was called the Dowding System, after Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, and it was a decisive factor in the Royal Air Force winning the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940. Not because British pilots were braver than German pilots, not because the Spitfire was better than the Messerschmitt, because the British could see the German formations coming before they arrived, and the Germans did not know how. But radar's triumph in daylight became its failure at night. When the Luftwaffe shifted to night bombing in September of 1940, the Dowding system could track the incoming bombers on the ground radar screens, but it could not guide a fighter close enough to see them in the dark. The chain home stations could tell a controller that a German bomber was somewhere in a box of sky 10 miles wide. A night fighter pilot, squinting through his canopy into absolute blackness, needed to be within a few hundred feet. There was no way to close that gap. The result was the Blitz. From September 1940 to May 1941, the Luftwaffe bombed British cities almost every night. London, Coventry, Birmingham, Liverpool, Plymouth, Bristol. Tens of thousands of civilians died. And Britain's night fighter force, flying obsolete Bulletin Paul Defiants and Bristol Blenheims, shot down almost nothing. In the first months of the Blitz, night fighters were destroying less than one German bomber in every 100 sorties flown. The bombers came and went, almost at will. There was another dimension to the night war that mattered. The Germans were not flying blind either. They had developed a system of intersecting radio beams called Knickebein that guided their bombers to targets they could not see. A pilot flew along one beam until it intersected a second beam, and at the intersection, he dropped his bombs. The beams could place a bomb load within a few hundred meters of the target from hundreds of miles away in total darkness. A young British scientist named R.V. Jones, newly assigned to Air Ministry Intelligence as its first scientific officer, identified the beams from fragments of evidence, prisoner interrogations, and a mysterious document known as the Oslo Report, an anonymous package of German technical secrets that had arrived at the British Embassy in Norway in November of 1939. Jones convinced Churchill that the beams were real, and British engineers developed jammers that bent the signals off course, causing German bombs to fall on empty fields. It was the opening round of what Churchill would call the Wizard War. Jones was 28 years old. He would remain at the center of the electronic war for its duration, rising to become the Assistant Director of Intelligence for Science, and his ability to move from a captured document to a working countermeasure in weeks would become the template for how Britain fought the invisible war in the sky. 3 things had to come together before Britain could fight in the dark. The first was airborne radar, a miniature set small enough to fit inside a fighter aircraft that could detect a bomber at close range and guide the pilot onto its tail. The set was called AI Mark IV, and it was crude. Its range was barely 4 miles. Its minimum range was hundreds of feet, and the picture on the cathode ray tube looked like static to anyone who had not spent months learning to read it. But it worked. The second was an aircraft fast enough and heavily armed enough to catch a bomber and destroy it in a single pass. The Bristol Beaufighter carried 4 20mm cannon in the nose and 6 machine guns in the wings. It was not elegant, it was lethal. The third was ground-controlled interception, a rotating radar on the ground that gave controllers a 360-degree picture of the sky and allowed them to vector a night fighter to within radar range of the target. The first GCI station went operational at RAF Sopley on New Year's Day, 1941. The very first radar-guided night kill had been achieved months earlier, on the night of July 22, 1940, when a Blenheim of the Fighter Interception Unit, flown by Flying Officer Glyn Ashfield, used its airborne intercept radar to find and destroy a Dornier 17 off the coast near Bognor Regis. But that was a one-off. The Blenheim was too slow and too lightly armed to be a reliable night fighter. It took the Beaufighter to make radar-guided night interception a repeatable operational reality. On the night of November 19, 1940, Flight Lieutenant John Cunningham and his radar operator, Sergeant John Phillipson, of No. 604 Squadron, scored the first Beaufighter radar-assisted night kill, a Junkers 88, that crashed near East Wittering on the Sussex coast. The propaganda machine told the British public that Cunningham had exceptional night vision because he ate carrots. It was a deliberate lie to conceal the existence of airborne radar. His real advantage was the green glow of the AI Mark IV scope and the steady voice of Phillipson reading off the ranges. The process was new and terrifying. The ground controller would pass a heading and altitude. The Beaufighter would fly blind toward the estimated position of the target. The radar operator would hunch over the scope, watching for the telltale blip that meant a real aircraft rather than ground clutter or interference. When a contact appeared, he would begin calling corrections. Come left 5 degrees, target slightly above, range 2 miles, and closing. The pilot could see nothing. He was flying entirely on instruments, entirely on trust in the voice behind him. At a range of roughly 1,000 feet, if everything had gone right, the pilot would catch the faintest shadow against the sky or the blue glow of an exhaust flame and know he was looking at the target. Then he opened fire. If he lost visual contact, the process started again from the radar scope. It was brutal, painstaking, and frequently ended in nothing. But when it worked, the bomber crew never knew what killed them. The numbers tell the rest. In January of 1941, RAF night fighters flew 48 sorties and made 2 combats from 44 radar contacts. By May, they were flying over 600 sorties and making 74 combats from more than 200 contacts. RAF night kills climbed from roughly 20 German bombers shot down in March to nearly 50 in April to almost 100 in May. The Blitz did not end only because Hitler turned east toward Russia. It ended in part because, for the first time in the history of warfare, defending fighters could find and kill attacking bombers in total darkness. The secret was not the pilot. The secret was the cathode ray tube and the men who had learned to read it. But there is something you need to hold on to before we go further. The British had proven that radar could win the night war. The Germans were watching, and they were about to build a night defense system so precise, so elegant, and so lethal that for almost 2 years, it would make the night skies over Germany the most dangerous airspace on Earth for any man who flew a bomber through them. The man who built the German night defense was General Joseph Kammhuber, and what he created was, on paper, one of the most sophisticated air defense architectures ever designed. The British called it the Kammhuber line. The Germans called its operating principle Himmelbett, which translates to 4-poster bed. The system worked like this. Kammhuber divided the air approaches to Germany into a chain of rectangular control zones, stretching from Denmark through the Low Countries and into northern France. Each zone was roughly 32 kilometers long and 20 kilometers wide, and each one contained its own self-contained interception unit. At the center of each zone sat a Freya early warning radar with a range of roughly 100 kilometers, which detected incoming bombers and alerted the system. Then 2 Würzburg precision tracking radars took over. One Würzburg locked onto the bomber, the other locked onto the German night fighter, already orbiting in a holding pattern inside the zone. A controller sitting at a Seeberg plotting table watched both tracks converge on a frosted glass screen and talked the fighter onto the bomber's tail by radio until the pilot was close enough to make visual contact and open fire. It was precise, it was methodical, and in the right hands, it was devastating. In the early years of the Night War, RAF Bomber Command losses to night fighters climbed steadily. Crews that survived one tour of 30 operations counted themselves among the luckiest men alive. The night fighter pilots who operated this system became some of the most lethal aviators the war produced. Major Werner Streib, one of the original night fighter commanders, scored 66 confirmed victories, 65 of them at night. Oberstleutnant Helmut Lent reached 110 kills, 102 of them at night, before he was killed on October 7, 1944, when his Junkers 88 suffered an engine failure on approach to an airfield near Paderborn and struck high-voltage power lines. He was 26 years old. Major Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, whom the British called the Spook of St. Trond after his base in Belgium, became the highest-scoring night fighter ace in the history of aerial warfare, with 121 confirmed victories, all of them at night, including 9 British Lancasters destroyed in a single 24-hour period on February 21, 1945. He flew 164 combat sorties. He survived the war and was killed in a car accident in France in 1950. Their secret weapon, from 1943 onward, was a modification so simple and so lethal that the British did not fully understand it for months. It was called Schrägmusik, which means jazz music in German slang. It consisted of 2, or sometimes 4, 20mm or 30mm cannon mounted in the upper fuselage of the night fighter, angled upward at roughly 70 degrees. The night fighter pilot would approach a bomber from below, in the blind spot beneath the fuselage that no gunner could cover, and fire upward into the wing fuel tanks. The bomber would catch fire and fall. The night fighter pilot never had to expose himself to the tail gunner's field of fire. First used in combat in May of 1943, Schrägmusik was responsible for a significant portion of Schnaufer's kills, and an estimated hundreds of RAF bombers destroyed over the course of the war. Crews simply exploded or burned without ever seeing what hit them. The Kammhuber system at its peak was the most effective integrated air defense network in the world, but it had a fatal weakness that its creator never fully solved. Each Himmelbett zone could handle only one interception at a time. The 2 Würzburg radars could track 1 bomber and 1 fighter. If 2 bombers entered the zone simultaneously, the system could engage one and had to ignore the other. If 10 bombers entered at once, 9 of them flew through untouched. RAF Bomber Command figured this out. Instead of spreading their bombers across the sky in a loose stream that took hours to cross the defensive belt, they compressed them into a tight, concentrated bomber stream, hundreds of aircraft packed into a corridor, just a few miles wide and a few thousand feet deep, that punched through a single Himmelbett zone in minutes. The zone's 2 Würzburg radars might lock onto the first bomber, and the night fighter might destroy it. But by the time the fighter had completed the interception, turned around, and been vectored onto a second target, 400 bombers had already passed through the zone and were inside German airspace. The system that was perfect against 10 individual bombers crossing the line at intervals was overwhelmed by 500 bombers crossing at the same point in 15 minutes. It was a partial solution. Losses dropped, but they remained painful. But the real blow, the one that broke the Kammhuber system in a single night, came from something far simpler than a change in tactics. It came from strips of aluminum foil cut to a very specific length and dropped from the bomb bays of 700 British bombers over the city of Hamburg. Every like on this video helps preserve the memory of the men who fought this war in the dark, on both sides, and whose names are in danger of being forgotten. That matters more than any algorithm. Before the aluminum foil, there were 2 intelligence coups that made everything that followed possible. The first was a commando raid. On the night of February 27, 1942, C Company of the 2nd Parachute Battalion, commanded by Major John Frost, dropped into occupied France near the village of Bruneval on the Channel coast. Their objective was not a bridge or a garrison. It was a single piece of electronic equipment. An RAF radar technician named Flight Sergeant C.W.H. Cox parachuted in with the soldiers, dismantled key components from a German Würzburg radar installation on the clifftop, packed them into canvas bags, and the raiding party fought its way down to the beach and evacuated by sea. British casualties were light, a small number killed and wounded. The captured components confirmed the Würzburg's operating frequency around 560 MHz and allowed the telecommunications research establishment at Malvern to begin designing a jammer. The second was a defection. On May 9, 1943, a Junkers 88 R, one of the 10th, Staffel, Nachtjagergeschwader 3, landed at RAF Dice near Aberdeen, Scotland. The pilot, Oberleutnant Herbert Schmid, and crewman Paul Rosenberger had forced the third crew member at gunpoint and flown the aircraft to Britain. Spitfires from No. 165 Squadron escorted them in. The aircraft was carrying a complete, undamaged Liechtenstein BC airborne radar, the set the Germans used to find British bombers in the dark. It was the first time the British had seen the German airborne radar intact. They gave the aircraft the serial PJ-876, tested it exhaustively, and used everything they learned to design a device that would change the entire night war. They designed Window. On the night of July 24, 1943, 791 RAF bombers attacked Hamburg in the opening raid of Operation Gomorrah. As they crossed the North Sea, crewmen in each bomber began pushing bundles of aluminum foil strips through the flare chutes. Each strip was 27 centimeters long, cut to precisely half the wavelength of the Würzburg radar. When the strips fell through the air, tumbling and dispersing in the slipstream, they created thousands of false returns on every German radar screen, each strip reflecting radar energy exactly like the skin of an aircraft, the screens filled with noise. The Seeberg tables became unreadable. Würzburg operators stared at their scopes and saw what appeared to be 11,000 bombers where there were 700. The ground-controlled interception system, the backbone of the Kammhuber line, collapsed in a single night. German night fighter controllers tried to direct their fighters toward targets and found themselves chasing clouds of foil. Crews orbited their assigned zones, picking up contacts on their Liechtenstein sets that dissolved into nothing when they closed to visual range. One after another, experienced night fighter crews reported they could not distinguish real targets from phantoms. Some fired at empty sky. The results were immediate and brutal. British bomber losses over Hamburg dropped to roughly 1.5% from the 5% that Bomber Command had been suffering in previous raids. German flak batteries, which also depended on radar-directed gun-laying, fired blindly into the sky. Searchlight batteries, radar-controlled, swept randomly. The integrated defense that Kammhuber had spent 3 years building was, for that one night, and the nights that followed, effectively blind. The Hamburg raids continued for 8 days. The firestorm that erupted on the night of July 27th killed over 35,000 civilians and left the German leadership shaken in a way that no previous bombing had achieved. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, later wrote in his memoir Inside the Third Reich that a series of attacks like Hamburg, extended to 6 more major cities, would have brought Germany's armaments production to a total halt. He meant it. The attacks against the other 6 cities never came in that concentrated form, but the electronic warfare that made Hamburg possible never stopped. And the lesson the Allies drew from that night was not about fire or destruction. It was about the power of rendering the enemy blind. If you could take away his ability to see you, you could do almost anything. The Germans improvised. A bomber pilot, named Major Hajo Herman, proposed a tactic he called Wild Sow, Wild Boar. Single-engine day fighters, Messerschmitt 109s, and Focke-Wulf 190s, would be thrown into the target area to hunt bombers visually, spotting them against the glow of fires, searchlights, and marker flares dropped by Pathfinder aircraft. It worked at first. Over Cologne on the night of July 3rd, 1943, wild boar pilots reportedly claimed a dozen bombers. Over Berlin on August 23rd, they reportedly claimed more than 50, but the tactic was unsustainable. Single-engine fighters flying at night with no radar and minimal instruments crashed constantly on landing, ran out of fuel over blacked-out countryside, collided with each other in the darkness, and were shot down by their own flak batteries, who could not distinguish them from enemy aircraft. Winter weather and icing made it worse. The loss rate among wild boar pilots from non-combat causes was staggering. The more durable answer was zahm Sau, tame boar. Twin-engine night fighters equipped with the new Liechtenstein SN2 radar, which operated on a frequency that window could not yet jam, were directed into the bomber stream by running radio commentary and told to swim with it, making repeated interceptions along the route, using their own radar to find individual bombers within the stream. The SN2 gave them a range of roughly 4 miles and was largely immune to the original window strips. This tactic produced the single most devastating night for RAF Bomber Command in the entire war. On the night of March 30th, 1944, 795 bombers attacked Nuremberg. The weather forecast had promised protective cloud cover on the route. The cloud was not there. The night was clear. The moon was up. The bomber stream left condensation trails that hung in the cold air like a white highway painted across the sky. German night fighters assembled at 2 radio beacons, Ida and Otto, that straddled the inbound route and fell on the bomber stream in a running battle that lasted over an hour. Crews in the stream watched aircraft around them explode, each one a 3-ton bomb load and 1,500 gallons of aviation fuel detonating simultaneously, turning a Lancaster or Halifax into a fireball visible for 50 miles. 82 bombers were shot down on the outward leg alone, almost all by night fighters using zahm Sau and SN2 radar. By dawn, 95 bombers had been lost, with a further 10 written off after crash landing in England. More than 540 airmen were dead. More than 150 were taken prisoner. The loss rate was nearly 12% of the force dispatched. More men died that single night than Fighter Command lost in the entire Battle of Britain. Entire squadrons were decimated. Some squadrons lost every aircraft they had sent. For one terrible moment, it looked as if the Germans had found the answer. The SN2 radar, zahm Sau tactics, and the skill of experienced night fighter crews had combined to inflict a wound that nearly broke Bomber Command's willingness to continue deep penetration raids. But the British had not been idle. While zahm Sau was producing its victories, a secret unit called No. 100 Group, RAF Bomber Command, was assembling an electronic warfare force that would turn the Germans' own technology against them, device by device. The first weapon was serrate. Developed at the Telecommunications Research Establishment from the existing AI Mark IV radar, which happened to have antennas almost perfectly suited to receiving the Liechtenstein signal frequency. Serrate was a passive receiver that detected the radar emissions of German night fighters and gave the Mosquito crew a bearing to fly toward them. The Mosquito would close from behind using serrate for the approach, then switch to its own forward-looking AI radar for the final attack, confirm the target visually as required by the rules of engagement, and open fire. The German night fighter pilot, with his Liechtenstein radar beaming forward to find bombers, never knew that his own radar pulse was drawing a predator toward his tail. No. 141 Squadron, RAF, commanded by Wing Commander Bob Braham, began serrate operations in the summer of 1943. In 179 sorties, they claimed 14 German night fighters destroyed for 3 losses. The second weapon was even more insidious. It was called Perfectos. This device triggered the IFF transponders, identification friend or foe beacons, carried by every German night fighter. The transponder was designed to respond automatically when interrogated by a German ground station, confirming the aircraft as friendly. Perfectos sent the same interrogation signal from a Mosquito. The German transponder, unable to distinguish between a friendly ground station and an enemy aircraft, answered automatically, and the answer gave the Mosquito crew a precise bearing and range to the German fighter. The German crew never knew their own identification system was betraying their position to the enemy. And then there was the cruelest irony of all. The British had fitted their own bombers with a tail-warning radar called Moniker, designed to alert crews if a night fighter was approaching from behind. The Germans captured a Moniker set and developed a passive receiver called Flensburg that homed on Moniker's emissions, turning the British defensive device into a beacon that guided German night fighters straight to the bombers it was meant to protect. For months, British bomber losses climbed, and no one understood why, until a stroke of extraordinary fortune. On July 13, 1944, a Junkers 88G, one of the 7th Staffel, Nachtjagdgeschwader II, landed by navigational error at RAF Woodbridge in Suffolk. The crew had become disoriented and mistaken the English coast for the Dutch coast. The aircraft was captured intact, and it was carrying 3 of Germany's most closely guarded secrets, simultaneously. It had the new Liechtenstein SN2 radar, it had the Flensburg receiver that homed on Moniker, and it had the Naxos receiver that homed on the emissions of the H-2S bombing radar carried by British Pathfinder aircraft. In a single accidental landing, the British had compromised 3 German electronic warfare systems at once. Wing Commander Derek Jackson tested the captured Flensburg against British bombers and found it could track a Moniker-equipped Lancaster from more than 130 miles away, and could pick out individual aircraft even from a formation of 71 bombers orbiting between Cambridge and Gloucester. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris ordered Moniker removed from every bomber in Bomber Command immediately. Aviation historian Bill Gunston would later write that Moniker was probably responsible for more bomber losses than any other device, Allied or enemy. This is the part of the story I need you to understand, because it is the part the Germans never fully grasped. What was happening was not a single technological breakthrough, it was a system. The Telecommunications Research Establishment at Malvern, the Scientific Intelligence Network under R.V. Jones, the operational squadrons of No. 100 Group, the signals intelligence teams reading Luftwaffe Enigma traffic, all of them were connected in a continuous feedback loop. The British captured a German device, analysed it, designed a counter, deployed the counter operationally, monitored the German response through signals intelligence, and then countered the counter, all within weeks or months. The Germans were doing the same thing in reverse, but slower, and with a critical disadvantage that had nothing to do with technology and everything to do with institutions. The Germans had excellent scientists, they had excellent engineers, they had radar sets that in some cases were technically superior to their British equivalents. What they did not have was the institutional architecture that connected the scientist to the operator to the intelligence officer to the factory floor. The German signals establishment was fragmented among competing bureaucracies. The Luftwaffe's signals branch, the Army's signals branch, the Navy's signals branch, and the SS Communications Service all jealously guarded their own domains. Information that should have flowed freely between research and operations was bottlenecked by turf wars and personal rivalries that went all the way to the top of the Reich. The British, by contrast, had embedded scientists directly into operational commands. R.V. Jones, who was 28 when the war started, had the personal authority to walk into the office of the Chief of the Air Staff and brief him on a captured German radar component. At the Telecommunications Research Establishment, physicists who had been university lecturers 2 years earlier were designing devices that went into combat aircraft 2 months later. Churchill called it the Wizard War, and the wizards had a seat at the table where decisions were made. The German wizards did not. And that difference, more than any single gadget or device, is the reason the electronic war turned the way it did. The Americans entered the night war late and learned everything the hard way. The United States Army Air Forces had no night fighter tradition and no night fighter aircraft when the war began. The first American night fighter squadrons trained on Douglas P-70 Havocs, a hastily converted light bomber with obsolete radar, at Orlando, Florida. when the 414th, 415th, 416th, and 417th Night Fighter Squadrons deployed to the Mediterranean theatre, beginning in 1943. They were flying British Bristol Beaufighters, obtained under reverse Lend-Lease, fitted with the AI Mark IV radar the British had developed for their own night war. The hunting was thin. In the Mediterranean there were few night targets, and the ground clutter from the mountainous terrain made the Mark IV radar nearly useless at low altitude. The 416th Night Fighter Squadron, in 542 missions from January to May of 1944, including 2 months of operations over the Anzio beachhead, achieved only 33 airborne radar contacts and 2 confirmed kills. One engagement captures the difficulty. On May 14, 1944, Captain Harris Cargill and his radar operator, Flying Officer Freddie Kite, of the 416th, spent 25 minutes underground controlled interception guidance and another 15 minutes of maneuvering against a target that was dropping window and turning evasively in the dark before the rules of engagement allowed them to close to visual identification range. 25 minutes of stalking to confirm what the radar screen had been showing them for nearly half an hour. The frustration was immense. Crews flew night after night, staring at radar screens full of static, finding nothing. But the lessons were accumulating beneath the frustration, and the men who learned them would carry those lessons north to France when the real fighting started. In the Mediterranean, the 415th Night Fighter Squadron produced one notable success when Captain Harold Augsburger, the squadron commander, intercepted and shot down a Heinkel 111 carrying German staff officers in September of 1944. It was the kind of kill that never makes the highlight reels, but that intelligence officers valued more than a dozen anonymous bombers. What those months in the Mediterranean had taught them was how the whole system actually worked in combat, how ground-controlled interception functioned under fire, how the radar operator and the pilot had to function as a single organism, how the final approach to a target in total darkness required a sequence of skills that could not be taught in a classroom. The radar operator had to read the flickering scope, call out ranges and bearings, and guide the pilot onto the target's tail in 3 dimensions, while the pilot flew on instruments in absolute blackness, trusting a voice in his headset more than his own eyes. The last few hundred feet were the most dangerous. The rules of engagement required visual identification before firing. The pilot had to close to within 200 feet of an aircraft he could not see, identify it as hostile, and open fire before the target saw him or his own radar lost the contact in ground returns. The aircraft the Americans had been waiting for arrived in the spring of 1944. The Northrop P-61 Black Widow was the first American fighter aircraft designed from the ground up to carry radar and fight at night. It was enormous by fighter standards, a twin-engine, twin-boom machine with a crew of 3, pilot, radar operator, and gunner, painted entirely black. It carried 4 20mm cannon in the belly and, on some models, a remotely operated dorsal turret with 4 50 caliber machine guns. Its radar was the SCR-720, an American-designed airborne intercept set with a range of roughly 5 miles and a rotating antenna housed in the nose. It was not beautiful. Pilots who flew it said it handled like a truck with wings, but in the dark, with its radar sweeping the sky and its 4 cannon loaded, it was the most dangerous thing in the air that nobody could see. 2 P-61 squadrons operated in the European Theatre of Operations, the 422nd and the 425th Night Fighter Squadrons, both assigned to the 9th Air Force. The 422nd received its first Black Widows at Scorton in Yorkshire in May of 1944. Their first kill came on July 16, 1944, when Lieutenant Herman Ernst and his radar operator Lieutenant Edward Copsall destroyed a V-1 flying bomb over the English Channel. They had attempted an interception the night before, and failed when the tail cone of their aircraft imploded in a high-speed dive. After the Allied armies moved into France, the 422nd and 425th relocated to the continent and began engaging German manned aircraft. The method was the same as the British had perfected. A GCI station on the ground detected a target, vectored the P-61 toward it by radio, and the radar operator picked up the contact on the SCR-720 and guided the pilot through the final approach. Ernst described a typical engagement on November 27, 1944. Our GC. I notified a bogey below us at 20 miles away. I immediately dropped the nose into a full-power shallow dive. By the time we had closed to about 2.5 miles, we had it locked on our radar. The rest was a matter of closing the distance, confirming the aircraft type in the darkness, and pressing the trigger. The 422nd Night Fighter Squadron's finest hour came during the Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944. When the German Ardennes offensive broke through on December 16th, the weather that grounded most Allied tactical aircraft did not stop the night fighters. The Black Widows flew in conditions that kept everything else on the ground, hunting German aircraft attempting to support the offensive under cover of darkness. The squadron was operating with a skeleton force. At one point during the battle, the 422nd had only 4 or 5 airworthy P-61s, the rest grounded by maintenance failures and a chronic shortage of spare parts and replacement aircraft. The mechanics worked through the nights in freezing conditions, cannibalizing downed Black Widows to keep the surviving few flying. Every sortie that launched during those critical weeks was a small miracle of maintenance as much as a feat of airmanship. On the night of December 26, 1944, First Lieutenant Paul Smith and his radar operator First Lieutenant Robert Tierney scored their 5th aerial victory and became the first American night fighter aces of the war. They had made 2 kills in a matter of 2 hours, hunting in conditions of absolute darkness and freezing cold over the Belgian countryside. Both men were in their early 20s. By the end of the war, the 422nd Night Fighter Squadron had scored 43 confirmed victories over manned aircraft and 5 over V-1 flying bombs, making it the top-scoring American night fighter squadron of the entire war. They had done it with a handful of aircraft that were constantly breaking down, in weather that would have grounded any sane pilot, guided by radar sets that required constant maintenance and operators who read them the way a doctor reads an X-ray, by instinct and experience, and thousands of hours of staring at a screen that most people could not make any sense of at all. If your father or grandfather served in any branch during the Second World War, in any theatre, I would be honoured to read their story in the comments. Those details, the unit, the posting, the thing they remembered that never made it into any official record, deserve to be preserved by the people who carry them. So here is the question that matters. The Germans were not stupid, they were not technologically backward. Their night fighter aces were among the most skilled combat aviators who ever lived. Their Liechtenstein SN-2 radar was in some respects technically equal to anything the Allies had. Their engineers had designed the Heinkel Tu-19, a purpose-built night fighter that was, by most assessments, the finest dedicated night interceptor of the war. On its combat debut on the night of June 11, 1943, Major Werner Streib flew the prototype and shot down 5 RAF bombers in 77 minutes before crash landing when his flaps failed. 5 kills in one sortie, in one aircraft. On its very first night in combat, why, then, did Germany lose the night war? The Heinkel Tu-19 is the place to start, because the story of that aircraft is the story of everything that was wrong with the German system. Kammhuber had championed the Heinkel Tu-19 and ordered it into production after seeing the prototype in November of 1942. General Feldmarschall Erhard Milch, the head of aircraft production, wanted it cancelled in favour of the cheaper and already available Junkers 88G. The bureaucratic war between Milch and Kammhuber consumed months of effort that should have been spent building night fighters. Kammhuber was eventually removed from his command. Production of the Heinkel Tu-19 was officially ended in May of 1944, though Heinkel continued building them at a trickle. Fewer than 300 were ever built. The best night fighter of the war was strangled in its cradle by a procurement dispute between two men who cared more about being right than about winning. Above both of them sat Hermann Göring and Adolf Hitler, and their priorities made the bureaucratic problem catastrophic. Hitler was obsessed with bombers and retaliation. The V-1 flying bomb program, Operation Steinbock, the so-called Baby Blitz of early 1944 that sent German bombers over England in a futile campaign that cost 329 irreplaceable aircraft. All of these consumed resources that could have gone to night fighter production and pilot training. Göring's interference in Luftwaffe technical development was legendary and almost uniformly destructive. When German officers reported the truth about Allied air superiority, Göring dismissed them or relieved them. When Kammhuber presented realistic assessments of what the night fighter arm needed to counter the growing electronic threat, Göring replaced him. Senior officers learned that presenting unwelcome information was a career-ending act, and so they stopped presenting it, and the decisions kept getting worse. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel wrote from Normandy that anyone who had to fight against an enemy in complete command of the air fought like a savage. Field Marshal von Kluge told Hitler directly that against total enemy air superiority, no tactics existed to compensate. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels confided to his diary in March of 1945 that Germany's entire military predicament was due to enemy air superiority. They all knew. None of them could change it. Then the fuel disappeared. The Allied strategic bombing campaign against German synthetic oil plants, beginning in earnest in May of 1944, struck at the single most critical resource the night fighter force depended on. Not airframes, not radar sets, aviation, gasoline. By the spring of 1945, the Luftwaffe was receiving, by some estimates, barely 3% of the aviation fuel it had consumed in 1943. Training hours for new night fighter crews were slashed to a fraction of what they had been. Replacement pilots arrived at operational squadrons with minimal instrument flying experience and almost no training on the specialized radar equipment that made night interception possible. Flying a night fighter was among the most demanding tasks in military aviation. It required hundreds of hours of practice to master the coordination between pilot and radar operator that made the difference between finding a target and flying past it. The men arriving at German night fighter bases in late 1944 had a fraction of that training, and it killed them. The experienced men were dying faster than they could be replaced. The majority of German night fighter aircrew who scored victories during the war did not survive to see the end of it. The men who died first were the ones who flew the most, who pressed their attacks closest, who were best at reading the radar and closing for the kill. Every ace lost was replaced by a novice who was statistically more likely to die on his first combat sortie than to survive his first month. The night fighter arm was consuming its own best people, in exactly the same way that the German infantry was consuming its best officers on the Eastern Front. And at the very end, there was the jet that came too late. Oberleutnant Kurt Welter flew single-seat Messerschmitt 262 jets against RAF Mosquito intruders over Berlin in the final months of the war, commanding a unit called Kommando Welter, later redesignated as the 10th Staffel of Nachtjägerschwader 11. Welter claimed dozens of Mosquitoes, though his total has been disputed by historians who have cross-referenced his claims against confirmed RAF losses and found that the verifiable number is significantly lower. A handful of two-seat radar-equipped Messerschmitt 262B variants also flew, but there were never more than a few airworthy jets available at any time. The jet night fighter could have changed the war. It arrived when the war was already decided. The parallel is exact. The same institutional dysfunction that strangled the German infantry's ability to practice Auftragstaktik, mission tactics, on the Eastern Front, the micromanagement from above, the destruction of trust between leadership and the men doing the fighting, the replacement of experienced practitioners with untrained novices, strangled the night fighter arm's ability to adapt to the electronic war. The technology existed. The talent existed. The system that connected them was broken. Verdict. So here is the answer to the question the German night fighter crews were asking across the autumn of 1944. How are they finding us? They were finding them with their own radar. The Liechtenstein set the pilot trusted, the green glow he had spent months learning to read, the pulse that reached out into the darkness ahead of his aircraft to reveal the bombers he was hunting. That pulse was also reaching backward. It was radiating in every direction, and somewhere behind him, a mosquito crew with a serrate receiver was watching that radiation paint a line across their scope, a line that pointed directly at him. They did not need to see him. They did not need to hear him. They needed him to do the one thing he had been trained to do, turn on his radar, and the moment he did, he lit himself up like a beacon in a dark sea. It was not only the Liechtenstein, the IFF transponder, the identification beacon that was supposed to confirm a German fighter as friendly to ground stations, was being triggered by perfectos from miles away, giving mosquito crews a precise range and bearing without a single emission from the attacking aircraft. And when the Germans developed Flensburg to home on the British Monica tail warning radar, the British discovered the trick, ripped Monica out of every bomber, and left the Flensburg receivers searching for a signal that no longer existed, while serrate and perfectos continued to work, because the Germans could not simply stop using radar and IFF without blinding their own night defense system entirely. That was the trap. To fight at night, the Germans needed electronics. To use electronics, they had to emit signals. To emit signals was to be found. The weapon and the vulnerability were the same object. What they could not do was solve it, because solving it required an institutional speed of adaptation that their system could not produce. The honest verdict on the German night fighter arm is this. It contained some of the most skilled and courageous aviators of the war. Lent, who scored 110 victories before an engine failure and a power line, killed him on a routine flight at 26 years old. Schnaufer, who destroyed 121 bombers and survived the war only to die on a French road 5 years later. Streib, who proved what the Heinkel 219 could do and then watched the bureaucracy kill the aircraft. Pilot for pilot, the German night fighter aces were almost certainly more skilled than their Allied counterparts. What the Allies had was not better individuals, it was a faster system. A system that connected the scientist to the intelligence officer to the factory to the cockpit in a loop that turned faster than the German loop. A system in which an error, like Monica, could be identified and corrected across an entire bomber force within weeks, once the evidence was clear. Watson Watt was real. Cunningham and Philipson were real. John Frost and Flight Sergeant Cox, who parachuted into occupied France to steal a radar, were real. Herbert Schmid, who defected with his Junkers 88 to Dice and handed the British an intact Liechtenstein, was real. Bob Braham of No. 141 Squadron, who led the first Serrate missions and became one of the most decorated pilots in RAF history, was real. Lieutenant Herman Ernst and Lieutenant Edward Kopsel of the 422nd Night Fighter Squadron, who destroyed their first target over the Channel in a P-61, were real. Paul Smith and Robert Tierney, who became the first American night fighter aces over the Ardennes on the night after Christmas, 1944, were real. R.V. Jones, who was 28 years old when he started fighting a war with physics instead of a rifle, was real, and the German crews who died in the dark, killed by their own radar emissions without ever seeing what hit them, were real. Most of the men on both sides of that war came home and went back to lives that had nothing to do with radar or darkness or the sound of cannon fire. Most of them did not tell their stories. Most of them are buried under stones that give a name, a date, and a service number, and not the thing they actually did as young men in a cockpit they could not see out of, trusting an instrument that painted the invisible world in green light. The Germans, in their operational reports, and in the private admissions their officers made when they thought no one was recording, kept reaching for the same explanation. The British were always one step ahead. The British somehow knew what we were going to do before we did it. The British had turned our own weapons into theirs. They were right about all of it, but what they could never quite articulate was the architecture behind it. They could see the effects. They could not see the invisible cycle of capture, analysis, countermeasure, and deployment that ran faster than anything their own institutions could produce. The Germans had the technology to compete. They did not have the institutions to keep up. And in a war decided by the speed of adaptation, having the best radar in the world means nothing if the enemy can hear your radar before you can hear his. How are they finding us in the dark? That was the question. And the answer was hiding in plain sight, glowing green on the instrument panel of every German night fighter that ever took off into the blackness. The enemy was not finding them despite the darkness. The enemy was finding them because of the very technology they used to fight in it. Every Liechtenstein pulse, every IFF response, every emission from every piece of electronic equipment on board was a thread the Allies had learned to follow. The Germans could not cut those threads without grounding their entire night defense. And so they flew, knowing they were hunted, unable to stop being visible to an enemy they could not see. There was no secret weapon. There was just a faster loop. And the men inside that loop, on both sides, were not paragraphs in a manual. They had names. They flew into darkness. They trusted instruments they could not fully understand, in aircraft they could not always see out of, against enemies they would never meet on the ground. And they deserve to be remembered not by the machines they flew, but by the courage it took to fly them into a sky where the only thing between life and death was a green line on a screen that most people could not read. If this investigation gave you something to think about, subscribe. There are more of these stories. Most of them are about ordinary men who were handed extraordinary machines and asked to do impossible things in the dark, over enemy territory, with nothing between them and death but the skill of the man sitting behind them, reading a scope. And most of them did it without anyone ever knowing their names.